Hi, everybody. Welcome back to a Good Run podcast with Daniel Feldman. My name is Asher Feldman, and this is episode 11, John Lindsay for President. This is the second, you could almost call it a sequel to the John Lindsay for Mayor podcast from earlier in our run. And on this episode, Leah and Dan discuss the many characters and personalities that defined the Lindsay campaign as it ran through Massachusetts, Indiana, Florida, and the pieces of the puzzle that ultimately did fall apart. Hope you guys are enjoying a Good Run podcast. We're back on a pretty regular schedule for publishing. Make sure you're following along on Twitter, your favorite podcasting app, and on our blog. And we're looking forward to keeping you guys filled up with podcast episodes the rest of the year. Thanks so much and enjoy this episode of A Good Run with Dan and Leah.
Welcome to A Good Run with Dan Feldman and me, Leah Feldman. We are beginning podcast number 11. Today, we are talking about a series of events that took place under what Dan characterizes as an unsuccessful presidential campaign with John Lindsay. Now, you open up this post talking about the events that took place and the places you were. So you were in Massachusetts, you were in Indiana, you were in Florida. And while all of that I find fascinating, and obviously the events were influenced by the atmosphere you were in, what I find you emphasize more than the places you were the people you met along the way. As you go through this blog post, you talk about a number of characters that all were involved in the Lindsay campaign, but were more influential to you directly. Like Louis Bouchette, Steve Brill, Gordon St. Angelo, and even a young woman named Cookie. Can you talk a little bit about how the experience of the campaign maybe would have been, or how these folks influenced you along the way?
Well, the first person you mentioned was Louis Bouchette, who I had met, I think, very briefly when I was a New York City Urban Fellow. He was working for Sid Davidoff, who was a key mayoral aide, who I didn't like very much, but a very political guy. Lee became a lobbyist. In any case, but I don't, somehow or other, I don't remember whether I initiated the communication or they did, but when I was this is now my second year at law school at Harvard, and there was some communication between the Lindsay presidential campaign, which had just started, and myself. And Louis Bouchette got in touch with me and said, why don't you should be the Massachusetts coordinator for Lindsay for president. So I was in that role in, I guess it must have been the fall of 71. And in that capacity, I tried to recruit student leaders from around the state to get involved in the Lindsay campaign. And one very memorable such leader was the student president at Smith College, who I had met earlier in the Lowenstein effort in registration summer. So I went out to Smith and I met with her, and I I gave her my analysis of the forthcoming presidential campaign, which is that Ed Muskie, who was the establishment favorite, clearly was going to get the nomination, but John Lindsay could win enough support so that in order to have a united Democratic Party, Muskie would have to move somewhat to the left to accommodate Lindsay's support. This Smith student body president said, no, I think there's a different candidate who would be a stronger candidate in the primaries. His name is George McGovern. Well, McGovern did very poorly in the general election, but he did considerably better than Lindsay in the primaries, and in fact considerably better than Muskie. He was the Democratic nominee. So this student body president, who of course was once again Cecilia Gardner, later my wife, she was far more astute politically than I was. In fact, she was the New England coordinator for McGovern, and with probably a little exaggeration, takes credit for the one state he won in the general election, which was Massachusetts. In any case, I did not succeed in recruiting the Smith student body president for the Lindsay campaign, but I did recruit some other people, and I had a few people were sort of helping me, other students from around the state. And you mentioned Steve Brill. Steve is, of course, a immensely successful investigative reporter and publisher and book writer and so forth. But in those days, as a young Lindsay aide, and he worked for Lindsay and then later went off on his own. But at that point, he was involved in the Lindsay presidential as well. And somehow, although I was the Massachusetts coordinator, he got involved in Massachusetts some way or other. I don't remember the details. But he was so thoroughly obnoxious that one of the fellows who was helping me out, who came from a tough part of a city called Fall River in Massachusetts, which was overall kind of a tough city in those days, may still be, I don't know. Anyway, he said, "Listen, I know some people in Fall River, $25. There won't be any more Steve Brill." I thought that might have been an overreaction, so. I don't think Steve Brill is aware that I saved his life. But, I actually ran into him a few months ago, and his sister had been a classmate of mine in high school. And I just didn't tell him the story. I just said, "Give my regards." In any case, so I was the unpaid volunteer Massachusetts coordinator until a few months later, the campaign brought in the John Martillo organization. John Martillo was a very capable, experienced political professional who did get paid, I believe. I'm fairly confident, and they took over the reins of the Massachusetts effort from me. But meanwhile, I alerted the campaign that I had had some Indiana experience the month I'd spent down there for Al Lowenstein in registration summer. And so whether it was Louis, I don't remember, or someone else, they said, "Well, you could be helpful to us. Why don't you go down to Indiana, and Lindsay's going to fly into the Indianapolis airport in a few weeks." And we had to build a crowd, basically, so that when the press covered the event, it would look appropriately enthusiastic and, show that his campaign was in good shape. So that was my assignment. And so I flew into Indianapolis, and Gordon St. Angelo was the Democratic state chair, and of course I had established some relationship with him when I was doing the registration drive for Lowenstein a few months earlier. So once again, he was kind enough to give me a desk in the headquarters, and I think the Lindsay campaign had probably also cleared with him my presence, and so I began essentially lining up people to attend the rally for Lindsay at the airport. Now this is not so simple, because the airport was, as I recall, at least 30 or maybe more miles from Indianapolis. Well, maybe not. Maybe it was 30 minutes. Anyway, it was a ways. It wasn't easy to get people at the airport. I mean, if it was, if the rally were in downtown Indianapolis, people could just, come out of their offices and show up. But here we had to transport them to the airport. So I remember having, I went to a lot of campuses, the same campuses I'd been during the summer, trying to get students. Maybe we could get buses of students to come, and we had some kind of relationship with the labor unions, so that I know a number of unions said that they would send people to the rally. We had some buses for them, and there was this, and there was a hierarchy in the campaign. There was a fellow named Donnie Evans who was higher up in the campaign, but under him was Walter Hinckley, and I was reporting to Walter, and Walter was always sort of pressing me to make sure all the people would show up and so forth. And I was working hard at this. Of course, I was supposed to be in law school at Cambridge at the time, but I was in Indiana doing political work. So anyway, the morning arrived. Lindsay his plane hadn't arrived yet, but we're waiting for our people, and several of the buses I had ordered simply didn't show up. Apparently they hadn't filled them, and Walter started like pushing me and shoving me, what's going on? Blah, blah, blah. And I remember very distinctly saying to him, Walter, you do that one more time, I'm going to be in jail and you're going to be in the hospital.
Oh, gosh.
And then he backed off.
This was out of nerves that it was gonna...
But the fact is, I had lined up enough backup buses so that we ended up with a good crowd. We had a few hundred people there, and Lindsay came, and it was fine. But that wasn't the end of my Indiana stay, because Lindsay was then going to make stops at various other cities, Terre Haute, possibly Gary, Bloomington. I don't remember exactly which cities, but he had this Learjet at his disposal, which was a small jet that seated maybe 6 or 8 people. And so for the next few days, I was flying around Indiana with Lindsay, staying at the same hotels he was at, doing whatever advance work had to be done at those cities.
Was this your first personal time spent with Lindsay?
Yes, and he was so impressive. The guy was like myself. We were up at 6 and working all day and at meeting people till midnight. And I remember after a day like that, an utterly exhausting day, sitting with him and a bunch of reporters who he was regaling with funny stories. He was just fabulous. Huh. And because the other thing was, I on one occasion, for some reason, I don't remember what, I had to bring something to him. I don't know. Anyway, he was in his hotel room in his underwear. And most people never see the guy in his underwear.
Well, sure.
He was unbelievably skinny. He was incredibly good looking, movie star, handsome, easily better looking than most movie stars. But a wraith, so skeletally skinny.
Well, he clearly poured his whole heart and energy and soul into the campaign.
Yeah, I understand that. But the guy's his frame was such that it was just incredibly thin. It was amazing. But it was just a little thing. But he was funny. He was just a delight. Really great guy to work with. So that was the Indiana thing. Now, of course, that was well in advance of the Indiana primary. The Indiana primary wasn't going to be till much later in the year. The truth is, sadly, he never made it to the Indiana primary. He had to drop out before that.
Why?
He did horribly. And in fact, the next phase of the campaign that I was actively involved in was really where it all came apart. And that was Florida. The Florida primary was, I believe, in early April or sometime in April, I think. And so I spent several weeks in March based in Miami. And this time I wasn't doing advance work. I was working on the primary, because now he was actually going to be faced with a primary, which he had to compete in. Mm-hmm. And the problem in Florida, or one of the problems in Florida, was that Lindsay at this point had made so many enemies in New York, particularly the school strike, where the divide between the mostly Jewish and to some extent Italian United Federation of Teachers, led by Al Shanker, and the empowered black leadership of communities like Ocean Hill, Brownsville, people like Rhodey McCoy and Sonny Carson and so forth, was a real ferocious antagonism, or created a ferocious antagonism between many white, Italian, and Jewish constituents and black constituents, and the Jewish and Italian ones, and obviously I'm not saying everybody, but particularly in the outer boroughs, saw Lindsay as siding with the blacks against them. And a good many of those people ultimately went down to Florida.
Sure, as many New Yorkers still do.
And there was, I remember some kind of, I think, helicopter flying over the Miami beach with a sign, some anti-Lindsay sign. I don't know if it was a quote from Meade Esposito. Esposito was the Democratic leader of Kings County then, and for a number of years thereafter.
Sorry, did you say his first name was Meade?
Meade, M-E-A-D-E. Meade.
Like the drink?
Well, yeah, that was his nick. His real name is Amadeo.
Oh, okay.
Meade is his nickname.
Sure.
And Esposito said publicly, as in a message to Lindsay, come home, little Sheba.
Oh.
So, it was it was clear to many that he wasn't going to do well, and in fact, so poorly in the Florida primary that I think he was still in the ballot for the Wisconsin primary, which was after that. But by then, it was clear the campaign was going nowhere.
Yeah.
And my own experience in the campaign was mostly unhappy and unpleasant. First, I had absolutely no money, so we were living off this horrible fake champagne that somebody gave us a case of. In
gosh.
Headquarters. It was sickening stuff.
Sugar and alcohol, not something to live off of.
But particularly poorly constructed.
Were you not being paid?
No.
Oh, gosh.
Well, as a matter of fact, I spent, I think it was $50 or $75 or something to go down there, which to this day the Lindsay campaign owes me. They never reimbursed me. They were supposed to reimburse. But the people down there that I was working with in the campaign, from New York mostly, but they were not congenial, and the circumstances the weather was oppressive. Everything about it was sort of unpleasant, and then the results were horrible.
Right.
The only nice thing was that I drove back to New York with a fellow named Leo Goldstein, who was a refugee from Hungary who survived the Nazis and then fled in the communist dictatorship. And took us a few days to drive, and he insisted on doing all the driving. And at least once every evening as he was driving, when he thought I was sleeping, which I probably was halfway, but nonetheless, I would hear him just say, God bless America. I mean, he was,
and Goldstein worked for the Lindsay campaign as well?
Yeah, he was a good guy. Huh. But his tremendous loyalty to the United States was kind of inspiring. And
is that what brought him to work for the campaign?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. He had been somehow peripherally involved in the Lindsay administration at one point. He was some kind of very good soccer player back in Hungary, and he became a soccer coach in some Lindsay youth thing.
Oh, very nice. Okay.
Yeah. So that was the nicest element to that. But the Lindsay campaign was was horrendously unsuccessful. He dropped out of the race at some point, as I said, shortly after the Florida and Wisconsin primary, and that was the end of it. Except the one additional political thing that came out of, I think, what someone, maybe Cecilia, referred to as the fevered swamps of Florida, was that one night, as I was sleeping wherever the heck I was sleeping, it wasn't any place good, during the Florida campaign, I suddenly had this idea about running for city council in New York. Maybe my experience in Holtzman's district leader race earlier had inspired it, or I don't know what. But my city council member at the time was a fellow named Walter Ward, and the race would take place in a couple of years, and I somehow had this epiphany that I should run for city council while I was down there in Florida.
The middle of the night in Florida.
In the middle of the night, yeah.
Sleep deprived, food deprived.
Yes, right.
This is when you thought, this is a good idea I've come to.
That's right.
And I would imagine that this idea was unimpeded by the fact that you had a year left of law school?
Right.
Yeah, okay.
So, yeah. So that's the Lindsay story. Yeah.
And to what fruition did this idea come?
What? Well, we have other stories about that.
I see. Okay.
That's for other podcasts.
So I suppose something good came of the fevered swamps of Florida.
Well, maybe. I don't know whether that council race was a good idea or not. We don't know.
So, I mean, it sounds like you spent, in personal and also in political arenas, a decent amount of time with Lindsay. And in that campaign, although unsuccessful, you encounter people that, I experienced in my life as, friends and sort of mentors and
your
comrades.
Mother.
Cecilia Gardner,
Right.
Probably chiefly Cecilia Gardner, but also I remember Louis as Uncle Louis as a kid,
sure.
and I still know that. I mean, I don't know if you spent any time with Craig while you were in Indiana. That Craig Sparks.
Oh, Craig. Oh, yes. I wonder. I'm sure I stayed with Craig again when I did the Lindsay thing. Sure, of course. Yeah.
And I would imagine that although it was not a successful campaign, I mean, you worked 18 hours a day. You successfully put together what you were instructed to do at his arrival.
Actually, there was one. I don't know. It probably doesn't speak very well of me as a law student, but I had brought not my corporation's law casebook with me, which is a big fat thing of 1,000 pages. But what's there's a company called Gilbert's Law Outlines, where they do a very short summary.
Like Spark Notes.
Like Spark Notes,
Yeah.
yes. So I didn't bring the casebook with me, but because, of course, I was supposed to be studying my corporation.
Right, let's remind our audiences here, he was still in law school.
My second year, yeah. So I did bring the Gilbert's Law Outlines for corporation law with me to Indiana, and I had been operating, as was Lindsay, on 5 or 6 hours of sleep a night, but I was okay. I was going forward until on one occasion I somehow had like a little time to spare, and I opened the Gilbert's Law Outlines. Within moments, I was sound asleep.
Oh, gosh. I suppose the nonstop flow of adrenaline came to a swift halt.
Right, exactly.
Well, I'm glad that even, although it was far from the forefront of your mind, during your downtime, you were capable of opening up a law book even for a moment.
Right.
So, I mean, many of these stories are, full with travel and characters. Your law degree from Harvard, by the way, not exactly easy to get into. Did it suffer from your adventures?
Yes, I was immature in a sense in those days. If I went back to law school now, I would have gotten so much more out of it. There were courses that I really liked that I did well in, but the bread and butter courses, contracts, property, civil procedures, they were wonderful, truly wonderful professors at the law school, and I just didn't take full advantage of them, and I kind of regret that.
I mean, was it just that your political fervor your energy was
Well, it was a combination of things. I had absolutely no background in business or any interest in it. And, frankly, most of what you study is business related. And that was something that, when you get older and you've signed contracts and signed leases or maybe bought property, paid taxes, when you do all these things, they become real.
Yeah.
None of it was real to me at the time. And so it was just boring.
Yeah.
There's any young person who's considering law school who may be listening, this is an argument for taking a few years after college or before you go to law school and getting a little more experience under your belt, which I didn't do. Well, that's not quite true. In fact, it was even worse because the experience I had in government, that year in New York City government, was so exciting and fascinating that it made first year law school even more boring in contrast. So it wasn't only my fervor for politics, it was also probably my passion to escape law school.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's, you managed to have time in your life where you were an attorney and maybe, it seemed to me like...
Well, later when I actually ended up teaching law, that's when I learned how to study law. I also learned that it was much more interesting than I thought at first.
Right.
I mean, when you dig beneath the surface, it gets very interesting.
You didn't give yourself time to dig beneath the surface while you were there.
Right, exactly.
But, I would imagine that coming back to it as a teacher, you were able to see it through a more experienced lens just because of the fact of being an adult and signing contracts and possibly buying properties, but also because of your experience as, a political worker.
Yeah, I suppose so. But I still wish I had given law school a fairer shake at the time.
Well, as far as I can tell, you turned out just fine without it.
Nice of you to say so.
Yeah. And I mean, although law school can be a place to meet interesting and informative and intelligent people, I don't know if you necessarily would have had the opportunity to meet many of the people that you did on, your travels.
Well, you're right about that. I can't deny that I had some really interesting and colorful experiences.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, we didn't talk about Cookie Mello. We forgot.
We didn't mention Cookie Mello, please.
This is a person who I remember, frankly, because of her name. But
how could you forget a name like Cookie Mello?
Right. When I was doing the Florida primary work, we tried. There was a college near the campaign headquarters called Barry University or Barry College. I don't remember. Anyway, we tried to recruit students from there, and one of them was this young lady named Cookie Mello.
Oh my goodness.
So
politically minded.
Somewhat.
Vaguely, yes.
Vaguely, yeah. So, Just talking about memorable characters.
Certainly.
Her persona kind of went with the name,
Yeah.
which made it even more memorable. But I don't have much more to say about Cookie Mallow. That's about as far as I remember.
Well, I think it nicely fills out the, colorful and illustrative group of people that sort of handed you off one to the next along the road to your campaign.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, these stories become almost platforms for, I never met these people, but the stories you tell about them describe them in such detail. And, you mentioned the plot of the events, but the people that you were with along the way seem almost to overshadow the places you stayed, you talk about, eating this awful food and sleeping so little, and, you don't color it in a really particularly negative or grungy light. You had people along the way that helped make this, the experience it was.
Yeah, well, that's the people were always the most interesting aspect of it.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. We will.
Thank you.
Yes, so we'll come back for more stories about your time with Lindsay and where after your campaign after law school brought you next. So we'll catch you all next time on A Good Run. And thank you so much for listening.